coming through.
Look at this.
Good.
Thank you.
Nice.
There we go. Oh. Welcome to the Bible and Theology in Color. My name's Esau McCauley. When I'm not here in the show, which I'm not here 99% of the time besides this week, I'm an assistant professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. I'm also a priest in the Anglican Church in North America. I can tell you a little bit about how this class was created to give you an idea as to what you might experience. I'm a biblical scholar by trade. So my PhD is in New Testament, Paul in particular. But about 3 years ago, I was teaching at a small institution, and this is often the case when you're at a small institution, you teach everything, right? So there is no Bible and theology, you're just like, you're the department. And so the theology professor went on sabbatical, and they said, Esau, will you teach modern theology? With a few weeks before the semester started. And I said, sure, how hard could it possibly be? I took the syllabus that was given to me, and I began to teach modern theology. And I got this theology book. And it kind of picked up everything from the 1900s, maybe pointing back towards, the beginning of modernism up to the present. And there was one chapter on liberation theology that included African Americans, Latinos, feminist theology, and that was like one chapter, and all the rest was all white dudes. And I said, well, hold on. The way that this story was told, there were no black Christians doing anything until like James Cone in 1960. And I said, well, hold on. My mom was a Christian before all of this, so how do you make sense of this? And so I taught that class for a couple of weeks, and I went to my dean and said, Dean, I can't do this. So I'm going to tear up the syllabus. We're just going to make it up as we go along, which is not something I recommend you do if you become a professor. And so what we tried to do in that class was trace the development of the African American Christian tradition with along with the Asian American tradition, Latino tradition. And then, forgive me for being subversive, we wrote it 1 week to white theology. Well, we talked about the development of evangelicalism in the mainline tradition, and I squeezed it all into 60 minutes. And that was the kind of first version of the New Testament in color, of which you're seeing like 3.0. So it's a little bit better, but that is the purpose of this course is to introduce you all to the history, the theological stances, and kind of the interpretive methods of ethnic minorities, particularly in the United States. I made a distinction in this class, which is in some sense artificial, in that I tried to focus as much as I can on North America. This is actually not a global theology class. We're looking at Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Because immigration makes some of this stuff a little bit of an arbitrary distinction, what I tried to look at, though, was how Christianity developed here. Now, a couple of things I want to say when you listen to material like this, and not to do this kind of pastoral care with my students. There's a couple of mistakes that you can make. One is hyper guilt. And that means you can look up and say, I went through my entire life and I never studied any African American theology. I never studied any Asian American theology. I never studied any theology coming out of Latin America. And I'm in a context where we're coming to grips with the history of racism in America. So in order to fix that problem, I'm just going to read all of this stuff and kind of adopt it all uncritically. That's actually theological paternalism, right? To say that, because this stuff is socially located and I'm from a history of ignoring it, then I'm just going to accept it uncritically. What I want to say is that's one mistake. And I have a lot of students who kind of especially 18 and 22-year-olds who I teach at Wheaton College, where they have this fear, they don't want to be like their parents, who kind of fought against the civil rights movement and made all of these mistakes. They want to be different. And so the way they do it is to correctly learn from black and brown voices. But that still requires real analysis. The second mistake is to engage in hypercriticism. And that's the assumption that because these things are socially located, they're somehow theologically inferior. And we have this thing, what I call like whole hog theology, which means if I don't agree with everything in the book, nothing in the book is useful to me. I think those two extremes, and part of that is related to be honest, a certain understanding of how Christianity functions in America, which we'll get to later. And the idea is that if I begin to accept some of these criticisms, I'm on the road to liberalism. And so what I want you to do is, what I hope that you do in this class, is to critically engage with a sympathetic ear, with a element of humility. The last thing that I'll say is we have to recognize when we don't know what we're talking about. So I'm a New Testament scholar. I'm also an Anglican priest, so I've said the creeds a whole bunch of times, right? And I can tell you, about the dual nature of Christ and all of this other stuff. But if I actually wanted to like get into Trinitarian and Christological debates, I quickly run up against my limits, right? And I can just give you the talking points, but I can't trace the development of ideas. So I'm not a Trinitarian, like I hold to Trinitarian theology. I understand the dual nature of Christ, but I don't know the discipline. And so if I went and argued with someone who actually does theology, they could have me, they could turn me to an Arian in 45 minutes. As it relates to issues of race and ethnicity, and its relationship to Christian theology, it is actually it's a theological discipline. And just because you've read a couple of Bible verses and you kind of have you see what I mean? It may be the case that you actually lack the competence. And having enough humility to learn is a part of the theological journey. So what I hope to do then in this class is kind of take you on that trip. So the patron saint of this class, do we have patron saints in the Shoulder House? Okay. Is John the Baptist. Now, anyone, because I can't read all day, can anyone give me at least read this part? Can someone in class? Anyone? Yes. And I'm going to get you all to introduce yourselves in a second. Yes.
You want me to read it?
Yes, read it.
As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in king's palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.
Okay, you exegetes. Everyone know when this occurs in Jesus' life? Does anyone know when this occurs in the Gospels? This is after John has been arrested and Jesus withdraws to the wilderness. And then they come out to the wilderness to see Jesus. Oh, this is, by the way, this is John, head straight cut off. I love it. Okay. This is the question, though. So John is arrested and he's martyred. Why is John martyred? It's interesting, though. John is martyred. This is a passive-aggressive way into socially located exegesis. John is martyred because he criticizes Herod's wife, right? Herod for marrying his wife. But here's the question, though. That is what we will see as a fundamentally moral issue, like Herod was married to the wrong woman. But what they don't understand is that Herod's divorce of the woman who he was with, destabilized the kingdom because his previous wife was related to the kingdom to the south. And so when you start talking about you being improperly married in this context, it relates to both his support within the wider religious community, and the stability of his reign. So we consider as mostly John giving a moral critique, it's also political, right? Just imagine today if we came up and said the president is married to the wrong woman and that relationship is fundamentally immoral. It's not just religious, it's political. So John finds himself arrested and killed for transgressing the powers that be. Jesus withdraws and he asks the question, what were you doing out there? What led you to go and see John? What he was saying is, he thinks that they went out to see John because they knew that they had encountered a prophet of the living God. So in other words, they didn't go out there to be supported by the status quo because those people were in another place. When you went to see John, there was the assumption that you would be challenged. And if you think about all the people who came out to see John, he never said, hey, I'm glad you guys are joining the church. I'm going to slowly introduce you to the gospel so that you're not offended. We're going to have great children's programs. We're going to teach you about how to feel holistically fulfilled. And then after about 2 or 3 years, we're going to tell you about the hard stuff. No, John said his church growth strategy was, you brood of vipers who warned you to flee from the coming wrath. He said, so what were you doing out there? You went out there because you knew he was someone who loved you enough to tell you the truth, even when it hurt you or it challenged you. So the question is, why did you sign up for this course? What did you come to see? Right? Why are you here? And that is actually the first question. So this is what I want to do. Tell me who you are, where you're from, what did you come to see? What do you hope to learn? And then really briefly, what experience do you have of learning about African American, Latino, Latina, or Asian American Christianity? So I want to get to know you. Anybody, why don't we start at the back and go forward this way? We'll start over there. And then we're going to Zoom people in too.
My name is Jay Greener. I'm the rector of Church of Redeemer, which is in Highwood, Illinois, north suburbs of Chicago.
Okay.
And I signed up for the course because we are in the middle of this conversation in our church. And it's the first thing in my 15 years here that is actually dividing a multi-generational church.
Yeah.
And we have these uncritical voices. We have people that are pushing back. So I signed up to kind of get in myself to the larger conversation. So that's really what I hope to learn is how to rightly parse this. How to really, what do I need to be listening? What are the voices that are important? How does the sociology relate to theology and history and so on? And I've been a pastor a long time and have a lot of friends in different traditions. And I've done a lot of mentoring across cultures. But I think I've got a lot to learn, so that's why I'm here.
What's that? Give me your name again.
Jay.
Jay.
I'm Jack. I'm an apostolate for members of the ACNA from California. Moved to Wisconsin 2 weeks ago. I'm here in Minnesota for a year. Signed up for the course because I was here anyway. I hope to just get a good reading list, look through, and have a community of folks and a professor to kind of help press the right questions and help me get better at reading and understanding. The past 3 years I taught in almost all Mexican high school in Phoenix, where I taught American humanities. So a lot of my kids don't have theological authority in the community in Phoenix, and so I want to learn about the Hispanic tradition, and I have a personal interest in the Harlem Renaissance and what was going on there.
You're not going to get the Harlem Renaissance today, though. I'm sorry.
No. Yeah. So
I have a book idea about the Harlem Renaissance that's been floating around in my head. So one day I might want to write a book about it. But there's a little bit of Harlem Renaissance. I don't know if it comes up. Yeah.
Renaissance.
My name is Jacob Cofford. I'm an ordained pastor in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. I currently serve as a missionary in West and Central Africa, predominantly in Francophone Africa. I used to serve a parish in Gage Park in the southwest side of Chicago for a few years in the Latino community. Main interest, I worked a lot cross-culturally and have taken an interest kind of in the African diaspora and connections with the African continent and liberation movements and colonialism and structures. So maybe gain some insight from this course.
My name is Matthew Blows. I'm a postulant from the Diocese of West Texas, originally from Corpus Christi, Texas. I signed up for this course because it seems like the church, or at least the churches I've experienced in my life, has been handling, I guess, the issue of either multiculturalism or race relations or racial injustices just very poorly for most of my experience, and it seems very noticeable how much that's harming the witness of people of my generation. It's generally seems to always be used as a mark against the church or even Christianity writ large. So it seems like we really need to fix, or at least really need to work on that. It's just becoming glaringly apparent, at least in my experience, of how much that's hurting the mission of the church. Also, my wife told me I had to take this course. I actually found out that your wife was a pediatrician, and my wife was in med school. She's like, oh, you have to take it now and ask him about what that's like. I'm like, okay.
I'll get counseling session there later. Yes.
Oh, okay. I'll sign up.
Yes.
Could you, for the Zoom participants, just give a wave when you start speaking so they know kind of who they're looking at as well.
Yeah.
My name is Jonathan Muller, and I am a candidate coordination from the Diocese of Fort Worth,
Yeah.
and a senior here at the Sherman House. And I signed up for this course. I come from a fundamental Baptist background originally, and we don't do this at all. This is politics. You don't touch that. And since coming into Sherman House, I've slowly had my paradigm expanded on these issues, and when I found out you were coming, I was like, I really want to learn more about this. What do I hope to learn? I hope to learn how to parse through these issues, like the gentleman in the back said. My experience, or what experience you have learning about African, aside from a little bit of light reading that I've done so far in the Sherman House, little to none.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Julie Hendricks. I signed up for this course because racial reconciliation has always been a passion of mine, and it's kind of one of those things that kind of stands by my side as I walk through life. And so when you had this course, I was like, sign me up. What do I hope to learn? I've got a lot to learn, particularly about Asian American Christianity, the African American Church. I don't know anything, and my experience has been my husband and I have served with the Foreign Service overseas for most of my adult life, and then I served as legal counsel and spokesperson for the American Immigration Lawyers Association in the United States. And so he and I are very familiar with the Latino Christian experience, particularly right after the civil wars ended in Central America. And we also lived in West Africa as well, so I'm interested in talking to you about your West African experience.
West Africa's in the house. Okay.
Yeah. But you know, I have to say my West African experience is limited to my own experience in church, not actually as a policy or anything like that.
Can I see them? I'm gonna come over.
Yeah.
I'm gonna walk over. I'll walk over. You guys is okay?
Mm-hmm.
Can we do this? Hey y'all. Who are you? Why is it? Look at this. I'm looking at you. Hey John. It's weird because now maybe I should turn.
Oh
this
yeah,
up.
maybe.
Yeah, I'll go. This is worse than I thought it was gonna be. Here we go. John.
Yeah. Why
Oh, wow.
I'm thankful my internet's better than Shane's. That's
Good.
But I actually follow a 30-second story to explain why I'm here. I grew up in an Italian immigrant family. We kind of had this idea about what America was like. My family came here loving America because, we were poor Italian farmers, and coming here we could be something. And so, growing up in my world, that was what America was.
Yeah.
So I viewed everyone else through the lens of what America. And my first call as a priest was in New Orleans. And I got to experience really African American communities, Asian communities, Afro-Caribbean communities, and I got to, by listening, I got to see that maybe my America wasn't everybody's America. My America was different than their America. And that was a really helpful experience for me to kind of broaden, to kind of try to broaden my theology and listen to different voices. And so now I find myself in a very different context on the Mexican border, where, again, my idea of what America is and what my America's been and what other people's America is being expanded. So going along with all of that, right, the same thing. What my understanding of Christianity and church, all
Yeah.
this is different than what I've learned from others. So I really enjoy it. I feel like it really brings out the fullness of what the church is, our understanding of our Redeemer, all of that by kind of hearing all these different voices helps me see, I think, a greater picture of what the church is, the body of Christ is, in this kind of my small little world. So I'm here to kind of continue to expand that from my own knowledge, but also because it's really important in my ministry context.
Thank you. We're going to do, we'll let the rest of them do it after we take our first break.
Okay.
So, a couple of things. The purpose is to explore all the ways in which the gospel has been received and interpreted by the very cultures that make up this country. I want to let you all know that a lot of this class may feel like a history course. And one of the things that I noticed when I taught it before, people say, like, why is all of this history and where's the theology? And one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes what separates, especially ethnic minorities in the United States, from the majority culture are different readings of American history. And so there's a framework within which we interpret the events that occur in front of us. And so sometimes understanding how these things impact, how history impacts theology is important. So even when we're doing history, that history then explains why when we get to where we are in America, we're going to have people who see the same events profoundly differently. The other thing is, this is not complete. So I am not an expert on Asian American or Latin American theology. So you're going to talk about my strengths. Like African American is what I do. It's the context after which I was raised. This is where I do my biblical interpretation, a lot of my scholarship. But I feel like too often in America, the racial conversation is had along the black-white binary. And this is much more complicated than that. If we had time, we look into the indigenous peoples, but I can't do everything, right? So, but just understand, you might hear, for example, when we're doing African American stuff, I'll speak with probably a lot of confidence. And I will maybe give you anecdotes to explain. And then when you hear me talking about Asian American or Latin American or Latino scholarship, you might see me talk a little bit more from a distance. And that's just because I'm not an expert, but I'm doing what I can. And so this is not, and by the way, there are very few people who are actually experts on all three. But I just thought it's important to at least introduce you all to these topics, not as here is all that you need to know, but here's an orientation towards a larger conversation. I talked about this. I'm not an expert. And in some of this stuff, we're going to discover this together. So hopefully we might be able to wrestle some of these texts and say, I agreed here, I disagreed here, and we might come to some consensus. What I hope is that we all listen to one another with some charity, Because whenever you're talking about issues of race and racism and injustice, it's always this idea, am I going to say the wrong thing? But hopefully, if we ask questions in good faith, I will try to answer them in good faith. Now, I'm going to do this once, this class. This is the only time I'm going to do it. This is this lecture, which is to give you a theological and biblical framework for why we might do this at all. Right? I know there's this kind of emotional, we should care about this, but how does all of this fit within, I'm a New Testament scholar, I'm a Bible person, how does any of this fit within the wider purposes of what God is attempting to do in the world? So I'm going to give you a really brief whirlwind tour of a biblical theology of diversity and why any of this stuff matters. And we're going to start with the water of life. So I wrote an article a long time ago in the Living Church, which is what I think is one of my favorite articles, but you know, the things that you love, nobody actually loves as a writer. The things that you think are horrible, people love. The things that you love, nobody loves. Really interesting is that just last week, I wrote this article about parenting. And it's about my son playing baseball in the middle of the pandemic and what it's like to have a son playing baseball in the pandemic. And I thought this was the worst article I've ever written in the history of time. Like, nobody's going to love it. I had just gotten a job as a contributing writer of the New York Times. And so now I have to write every month. And all I had for this month is this little small story about my son playing baseball. And I thought, no one's going to like this. I send it to, they're not going to publish it. They're going to fire me. So I send the article in, and they say, oh, we need you to do this, that, and the other. So I fix it. Long story short, it comes out on Thursday. Then they put it in print, which is like, in publishing, if you get into print, you're in big boy school, right? Not only is it in print, it's in the Sunday Review, and it's on the cover. Like, it's like one of the top articles. Like, wow, they really love this article. Now, the article that I'm going to tell you about, my favorite article, in the Living Church, nobody read it. But I'm going to keep teaching on it because one day it's going to go viral. It's just like, it's been laying dormant for like 3 years. Its time is coming. But anyways, at the heart of the article was that the proto-evangelium, the first preaching of the gospel, is not in Genesis 3, where you kind of step on the head of the snake. You know this story? He'll bruise your head. No, you'll bruise your head, but he'll bruise your heel. They call that the first preaching of the gospel. The kind of eschatological victory of the woman's descendant over the serpent. I said, what if the first preaching of the gospel isn't there? It's actually here in Genesis chapter 2. Nobody agreed. I wasn't serious. It was a rhetorical ploy, right? Here it is. This is the story in Genesis. A river flowing from the garden flowed from Eden. By the way, I am right about this. This is not why this class is, but I'm right about this idea and the importance of this story. The importance of this story. A water flowed from Eden, and it was separated into 4 headwaters, named the first Pishon, and winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good, aromatic, and onyx is also there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It winds through the land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. And it runs along the east of Asher. The fourth river is the Euphrates. As you can see why this is not a super popular article. Maybe this isn't everybody's life verse. But here's the thing. You go to the end of the Bible. What do you see at the end of the Bible? See? I was right, wasn't I? Then they showed me the river of the water of life. You see it? As clear as crystal flowing from the throne of God, and the Lamb stood in the middle of the great tree of the city. On the side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing fruits, 12 crops of fruit, yielding a treat every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So my argument is this. Genesis presents like the water that's flowing from or through Eden, going out to the different nations of the world, including Cush, Africa, parts of the Middle East. This is the water. And if you trace it through, one of the things that you see after the fall is the bad level of water and a loss of abundance. And so the idea was that the same thing that was meant to give life to the peoples of the world, this was hindered because of the fall. And when you get to the end of the Bible, that water actually finally reaches the nations. And the point is that God always had, as a part of his plan, not simply the healing of the people who are located in one place, but his goodness going out into the entirety of the world. And you see that, and if we had time, we'll pick up the same idea that occurs in Ezekiel, where the water flows out of the temple. And this is in the show, so I can go full Anglo-Catholic for a second. Anyone done the Easter asperges? Okay then. Do any of you know what that is? It's okay. You know when they throw the water on you at Easter? Well, one of the chants that you say when they throw the water on you at Easter, the priest is supposed to say, out of the temple, the right side, both in Ezekiel and in Jesus' side when he's stabbed, goes to the world through which healing comes. You can't hear it because it's Easter time and everyone's shouting, I saw water flowing out of the temple, the right side thereof. The idea then is that God's creational abundance was meant for the nations of the earth. We have this thing called the fall, which I'm assuming you know about. So we'll skip past that. Don't say I don't care about the fall. We're just skipping past it. So things go poorly. Right? Things go poorly. That's it. Okay. Then you skip forward a little. By the way, we're gonna spend a lot of time. We're not gonna go this slow. We'll jump books. We're gonna spend a little time with Genesis. We'll get through this in a minute. You get to Lamech and his wives. You remember Lamech in the Bible? Lamech is the first jerk. No, just kidding. Lamech goes, this happened to Cain, and whatever. But I am going. If anybody bothers me at all, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. Lamech, the first jerk, is also the first person who has two wives. So what you see as a result of the fall, you have on one hand the expansion of human sinfulness, which in the Genesis narrative climaxes with uncreation, right? So on one side you see, as humanity expands throughout the world, you have this idea, the sin that spreads with humanity, right? But on the other hand, you have his brother. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father who played instruments and pipe. And Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. So what do you have there? That is a description of cultural creation, right? So you have this idea that music and instruments and the building of cities are expanding alongside human sinfulness. Now, if you add to that the idea that we all know in Genesis 1:26-28, that all human beings are born in God's image. You have this picture of humanity that kind of is articulated as we go through Genesis. Humanity is created in God's own image. Therefore, God's creativity is manifested in human creativity. While human sinfulness also spreads. What I want to argue is that mix of divine creativity and human brokenness is also true of cultures that are created by humanity. This is theology of culture creation, right? That every culture that exists in the world has both the creativity that comes from us being image makers, being made in God's image, but also manifestations of human brokenness. So there are elements of African American culture that are amazing. Our food, our music, our language. There are also portions of our culture that need the redeeming love or the redeeming power of the gospel. And every culture has that mix of good and bad. If I can anticipate some of the things I might say later, One of the problems, if you're going to talk about the history of kind of white Christian missionary thought, or even white Christian theological reflection, is the implicit idea that some cultures have more of the divine image in it than others. And that some cultures are more fallen than others, so they have further to go, right? So there's this inherent kind of disdain for the uncouthness of other cultures. You see this every time the missionaries went somewhere. Oh, all of the stuff they have to do has to become not just Christian, but European. The music, the clothes, the food, all has to change. And so what I want to say is we need to develop, if this account is true, a theology of culture creation. We're able to see in the varied cultures of the world both its glory and its fallenness. One of the things I will say is that the tendency is, when you're not from that culture, to see its fallenness and not its glory because it's different from your own. And oftentimes, the people who are best able to reform a culture are the people who are from within it. And so what we really have to do is actually bring the gospel to the culture as best as we can, and then help that culture discern the way, the leaders in that culture discern the ways which they need to rethink some of the things that they do. Any questions about that? My Zoom people? We agree, theology of culture creation? So then you get to Genesis 10 and the table of nations, which we're not going to read because who wants to read a bunch of names, right? But the real question is, why is the table of nations there? Because you have the creation of the table of nations, and then you have the scattering of the nations in the book of Genesis. But then you have Genesis 12:3. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you, and I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Now, this is often becomes, by the time you get to Paul, this forerunner to justification by faith, right? This idea of the universal blessing of the nations. And it's seen as this theological idea that justifies our salvation apart from the things that we do. Now, I'm not here to challenge that theological idea. I'm trying to ask you how it functions in the narrative of Genesis. They outline, here are the nations. The nations are scattered. And the question is, how is God going to gather the scattered nations of the world? And the answer to that question is Abraham. It's amazing how we de-ethnicize, is that a word? Abraham. His name is, what does Abraham mean? Why did they change his name? Father of many nations, right? And he's not talking about nation states, right? He's talking about cultures. The idea is that the varied cultures of the world will be gathered under Abraham. You can kind of say the whole point of the Bible, the whole point, is for a multi-ethnic community under the authority of the one true king. And somehow we've lost this narrative. Now, it's there, right? We preach it, but we separate this Abrahamic vision from what is actually happening in America. So in other words, God's purposes are inextricably tied to ethnicity and culture united under him. A monocultural people is antithetical to what God was promising to do in Genesis. So this class is in part the story of how this blessing comes to ethnic minorities in the United States. I'm just going to do this a couple more times. Genesis and the nations of the earth. This promise is repeated to Abraham and his descendants, and you see it over and over again. Now, this is one of my favorite stories, Ephraim and Manasseh. This story, when I read it, I was upset because even though I grew up in a black church, nobody ever told me. Turn to Genesis 48. Oh, you guys don't have Bibles. I'm so used to being in the shoulder, being at Wheaton College. For every prayer book you guys have here at Wheaton College, they have like 5 Bibles. So I will turn to Genesis 48. I was so bad, I came here and I didn't bring my Bible and I brought a prayer book instead. So if you have a Bible, I've been showdized. Okay. So Abraham is getting old, and Joseph's like, you need to go and see your grandfather before he dies. And you can kind of see it. Now, you see the picture there. Do you see how Joseph and his wife kind of look a little bit Egyptian? You see it? They look a little Egyptian. And do you see how the boys like miraculously turn blonde again when you get out? We missed that part, right? So they almost got there. And even Joseph and his wife, they just got different haircuts, right? But it says this. Jacob said to Joseph, the Almighty God appeared to me and he blessed me and he said to me, I'm going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give you this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants after you. So he sees this, and he remembers. He remembers what has happened. And so it says in where is it? In chapter 48, he then says, where is it? I can't find it. Well, in chapter 48, when Jacob sees these boys, this is what inspires him to say, I remember what God said to me. You get it? He sees in the fact that they're half Egyptian a fulfillment of God's promise. So you understand what's happening? He sees these two boys. He says, oh, they're half African. God made a promise to me that he was going to make me a community of different peoples, different ethnic groups. So then what does he do? He brings Ephraim and Manasseh into the 12 tribes. So African blood flows into the nation of Israel from the beginning. I have friends, you don't know about this. Anyone heard of the Black Hebrew Israelites? Yes. And I keep telling them, like, you don't need to join the cult. It's like right here in Genesis. Here's two Africans. Come on in. And not only does he bring them in, he brings them in and says, your entry into my family is the fulfillment of God's multi-ethnic vision. So, the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, the two bold-headed boys down there, is seen at the beginning of the fulfillment. I can only point to like what I would say is echoes of a larger story. By the way, things go really bad in Egypt, short story. Then God says it's time for you all to, take your stuff and go. A lot of stuff happened, plague, time to go. Everybody been at the party when you realize, you know what, we've overstayed our welcome. Let's take our stuff and leave. But there's this little verse hidden away here, like a truth hiding in plain sight. Who leaves when the people of Israel go up from the land of Egypt towards the promised land? The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. A mixed crowd also went up with them. When you guys hear the word mixed crowd, what do you think? Like when you hear that, like what idea jumps into your mind? Yes. Now, who might have been in Egypt who might have said, this isn't the place for me? Egyptians, but who else might have been there? Yes, do you know why? Because Egyptians was the center of culture. Imagine this. Egyptian is the major world power in their area at the time through which people come trade and they get up and they establish lives there because this is a place of trade. Imagine this happening in New York City or Chicago. And someone saying a mixed crowd left Chicago. Mixed crowd left New York. Now, obviously, it wasn't as diverse as New York and Chicago because, this is international. But as it relates to being regional, there was possibly, we know Egyptians went up there, but it's possible there are other nations of the world who were in Egypt at the time, who saw what was happening with the plagues and said, you know what? This might be the team that I want to join. Okay? Now, Naomi. You anyone know who Naomi is? Ruth. What is she? Anyone know where she's from? Moab. Is that Jewish? Is Moab like one of the 12 tribes? No. Oh, she's a foreigner. Look at this. You know the whole story of Ruth? And then they have like the little addendum at the very end, at the end of Ruth. Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. And he became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So it's almost like the Bible is making this point, that you can't tell the story of the people of God without the nations of the world being a part. And this may seem like, oh, this is redundant. I've seen this, I've heard these stories before. The question is, how did these stories inform our theology of ethnicity and diversity in the United States? And when you say things like, I don't see color, it's a sub-biblical idea. Right? Like when the idea is like, I don't see color, I don't see ethnicity. When the Bible is saying it's kind of a big deal that Naomi is a foreigner who's being brought into God's people. It's kind of a big deal that Ephraim and Manasseh are foreigners, they're being brought into God's people. It's a big deal that God made Abraham the father of many nations. God glorifies in ethnicity. And we kind of see it often as an optional extra in our churches. The king himself. We can't do all of like this stuff. We can just only point to it. Psalm 72. Can I tell you all a little bit about the development of the Psalter? Can we do this? Okay. So Psalm 1 and Psalm 2. Does anyone know what those are about? Psalm 1 is about the law. The second psalm is about the king. So the two foundational anchors at the beginning of the law of the Psalter are God's law, good for the soul, and God's king. They have this idea that the Psalter develops in chunks, and that you often see reaffirmation of either the law or kingship at these seams of the Psalter. So you see the king showing up in Psalm 2, you see him showing up in Psalm 72, where there's kind of like this division. And if you actually look, Anglicans, here's something. Who has the prayer book? I could even use the prayer book. Turn to Psalm 72. Sorry for the people of you who are online who aren't Anglicans. You shouldn't have signed up for this class. Get over it. This is the one time I get to be nerdy. Okay. Oh, they don't have it in here. Look at this. Oh, look at this. In Psalm 72, it may be in your Bible, it's not in the Psalter. It says that the Psalms of Jesse, the son of David, are ended. That verse it's in some versions of the Psalter. It's not in other versions of the Psalter. The point is, this psalm was seen at one point as the climax of the end of one major teaching section. And it ended with this discussion of David's prayer to Solomon, the one true and ideal king. And look what it says about him. Here's politics and ethnicity and justice, like David, critical race theorist. Anyways, he delivers the needy when they call, the poor and the one who has no helper. So understand, this is what he wants to be a description of Solomon. He has pity on the weak and the needy. He saves the lives of the needy from oppression and violence. He redeems their life, and precious is his blood in his sight. May all nations be blessed in him. Do you see what's happening here? He's saying that the king, now understand, this is a monarchy, so the king is the government. You get it? So when the people are stepped on by society, he says that the king, the authority, is the person to whom the nations, the people can turn to for help. And because of his just rule over the world, may all the nations be blessed in him. So what David has done is he's taken the Abrahamic promises. May all the nations of the world be blessed, and he's applied it to the king. So what he's saying is, may all the nations of the world be blessed through the just rule of the one true king. So how does Abraham's promises come about? Through a just and gracious king who blesses the nations of the world and who cares for the poor. Here's your theology of justice right here. It's like in the Bible. Like I don't even got to interpret it. I just got to read it. Okay. Here it is again. On that day, the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the people. The nation shall acquire of him, and his dwelling shall be glorious. This idea that one day the peoples of the world are going to turn to the son of Jesse, this promised Davidic descendant, and through what he does, blessing comes to the world. I'm going to do this again. So what happens when you get to the New Testament? An account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, son of Jesse. Who is this person? Who we worship? Who's the king of the world? He's the one who fulfills both the Abrahamic promises and the Davidic promises, both of which focus on blessing both the nations, all the nations of the world, and in the form of the one true king, there's a particular emphasis on the king's concern for the needy. So it is no surprise that when we get to Jesus' first sermon, he says, he talks about the good news to the poor. Let's skip the entire life of Jesus. Lots of great stuff happened. I can't give you the whole Bible because I got to do all of this in one lecture. The Great Commission functions as a fulfillment of God. This is my claim. When Paul, see, this is what happens when you spend 3 years reading Galatians, your instinctive brain just says Paul. So just understand that whoever you write, if you guys ever do a PhD, whatever book you do a PhD on is like stamped in your soul and you can't get rid of it. But Jesus, not Paul, believes that the Great Commission, this is my argument, functions as a fulfillment of God's creational desire to create a multi-ethnic community for himself. It is an announcement that the king has come. So when Jesus says, teaching them to obey all that I have taught you, or commanded you, what does Jesus actually command from the people in the book, right? So what tends to happen is we take the Great Commission and we use it as this inspiration for evangelism. So we go and we share people the means of getting saved, which is important, right? You should definitely tell people to repent of their sins and trust in Jesus. But Jesus told his disciples to make disciples. And how do you know what discipleship looks like? You have to actually turn back to the Gospels. And in those Gospels, you see Jesus showing concern for the poor. So Jesus' concern for the poor is an inextricable aspect of Christian discipleship as a part of the announcement that the true king has come. That doesn't eliminate the need for actual personal conversion. It just puts the personal conversion in a wider context. Paul is literally called the apostle to the Gentiles. What does he say? For he is our peace. And in his flesh he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is the hostility that is between us. Now, you all are Pauline scholars, I would assume, since you're all at least adults. Does anybody know what the issue was that he's talking about here in Ephesians? What is this dividing wall of hostility?
Those who were sons of the covenant and those that weren't.
Yeah, so in some sense, this seems like a slightly different kind of analogy, right? The thing separating Jews and Gentiles was the law that was put in place by God to protect the people of Israel from sin. But one of the other things that the law did was create the separation between Jews and Gentiles. And what Jesus Christ does on his cross was remove the law that kept the people separate so that the two people might become one, so that God might be glorified through the unity of these people across difference. Now here's the thing. The analogy to current ethnic strife it's not exact, right? Because we're not separated by a law put in place by God, right? We're separated by human sinfulness. But insomuch as the cross is an atonement for sin, it is also the thing that can bring us together, such that God is glorified through bringing peoples together across difference. One of the things that makes American, not just American, this is an international problem, what I call inter-Gentile racism is almost unheard of as it relates to the New Testament witness. The idea that like one Gentile would think that they were better than another Gentile, from a Jewish perspective, was like, y'all are all whack. Like, he was just like, because there's like one category, Jews and everybody else, right? We're different because we've taken this everybody else, subdivided it, and attached value to it. So in this sense, racism as we understand it in our context is different than what Paul and the other people are addressing. But I think the gospel still speaks to this issue with those kind of caveats in place. Right? Now, think about this. And I know, you guys know this is basic in Pauline theology. I still don't think it comes home as a theology of ethnicity. This is Ephesians. In the former generations, see, like before this, nobody knew about this. Have you ever, oh, this is being recorded, so I can't tell you about my wife. She won't get mad at me. There's nobody watching. My wife loves to tell stories, but she doesn't know how plot works, right? So she tells the story, and it goes on and on and on and on and on, and then the story ends. And I always say to her, like, there needs to be a climax at the end of the story. There needs to be something like makes the story worth hearing. So I always ask at the beginning, is this a story that just ends, or is this a story that actually has a point? And she goes, and I said, just lower expectations, right? As long as I don't expect it, then, because to me, the longer the story, the better the ending has to be. She doesn't believe that. She just thinks that the journey itself is the destination, right? So the question is, what is the climax of the biblical story according to Paul? What's the payoff? What's this thing that makes this whole story amazing at the end? This is Ephesians chapter 3, verses 3 to 5. And he says there's 5 different ways in Ephesians. In former generations, this is before now, the mystery was not made known to humankind. It has now been revealed. Here's the plot twist that nobody saw coming. Spoiler alert. Like Kaiser Sose, right? Are you seeing this in the usual effects? This is it. Like he's the guy. Oh, or this is sorry, I'm old now. But you know, The Sixth Sense, is that the one? Where like Bruce Willis is dead, you're like, oh my goodness, like, oh, this is amazing. Okay, it's also a movie you can only watch once, right? Then after that, you kind of ruin it. I'm sorry, spoiler alert. Okay. Yeah, it was 20 years ago. Yeah, Frodo gets rid of the ring. Oh, spoiler, okay. And speaking of this, sorry. I want to talk about that. I can complain about all of the TV shows whose endings were not satisfactory to me, but I'm going to leave that alone. Okay. What'd you say? I know, Lost. I was going to leave it alone, but you triggered me. I watched this. What's going on with the polar bear? The polar bear. Somebody explain it. Okay. Sorry, that was just me processing some stuff. Okay. In the former generation, this mystery was not made known to humankind, as it has now been revealed to his holy prophets, his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. This is this. The Gentiles have become fellow heirs, fellow members of the same body, and shares in the promise in Christ through the gospel. This is the climax. He's like, nobody saw this one coming. That God was going to bring the Gentiles in through the gospel. Paul thinks this is a mystery that like leads him to like these moments of pure adoration. There are these parts in Ephesians, Paul just goes just like, he just breaks into 2 or 3 verses of just praising God for this mystery. So, at the end, the beginning. All right. At this I looked, and there's a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, all tribes, peoples, and languages. I'm glad you talked about being in Francophone West Africa. Because the vision here of people from every tribe, tongue, and nation coming into the kingdom of God. The thing about language is language encodes culture, right? There are certain things that anyone who speaks Spanish, I speak no French, with French you can say, this doesn't come across well in English. It is an inherently Spanish phrase. And the act of translating it is something is lost. And I can tell you, even in English, African Americans have developed their own way of speaking and articulating in the world. And so when you talk about language being eschatological, insomuch as we bring languages into the kingdom of God, we bring cultures into the kingdom of God. So if language is eschatological, then culture is eschatological. Right? It's not like we walk into the kingdom of heaven and we all get an English chip downloaded into our brain and we all begin to speak English. Our cultures are transformed, but they're carried into God's kingdom. And that's part of the glory of the story. The ways in which the gospel did its work amongst the Spanish-speaking peoples of the world, amongst the English-speaking peoples of the world, amongst the French-speaking people of the world, amongst the German. You see it? And if you want to imagine what the kingdom of heaven looks like, just imagine sitting down and telling that story or hearing that story in German. This is not in the Bible, and this is my own hypothesis. I mean, I don't believe that we get this like download of all knowledge when you get into the kingdom of God. And I do think that languages continue to exist. So I actually think that if you want to communicate, you have to learn the languages. So I think that one day I get into the kingdom, my German, I know enough to get my PhD done. I could cite the 8 to 10 articles that we need. I'm saying this to Shane, who's doing the same thing, right? I know enough German to cite it and get my PhD, but I'm gonna speak it. But I think the kingdom of God is one day me sitting down and listening to my German brothers and sisters talk about their struggle for Jesus in this context and what their faithfulness look like in that culture. And listening to them sing hymns and praises to God's name. So that's what God's vision is, right? The eschatological worship of the very cultures of the world before the living God. Then how does it actually impact the way we think about multi-ethnicity and culture and our context? So, I want to argue that the Bible contains a story of God bringing glory to himself by creating a diverse group of people and bringing them into community around him and rooted in the good creation he has made. This is the story of the Bible. And I think because we told a different story, or we neglected this aspect of the story, it has left us unprepared. Every now and then, the culture moves away from the church, where there are values that arise in the culture that we can't really agree with, even if we kind of change the foundations for it, right? This place in which this culture kind of lives on materialism, the acquisition of things and status. And the church's only real answer to this is no. We're not defined by the things that we acquire. But we're in a context where our culture values diversity, right? That every single employer, university, business is trying to have more diversity. Now, they may have diversity for different reasons. And their understanding of diversity may be inadequate in a bunch of ways. But as a concept, this is something the church should say yes to, because it's all over the Bible. What has happened, though, is because there's a certain mentality that whatever the culture affirms, the church must oppose. The language of diversity is seen as threatening by churches. And it's become political. People say, if you hear someone talking about diversity or multi-ethnicity, run away. Or we say, I don't see color, or I don't see race. And even if you mean this, I don't judge people by the color of their skin. Well, that's fine. That's one thing to say, right? But the idea that you don't see it, that you don't acknowledge it, you don't understand the differences in the histories and the things that inform it, it's fundamentally sub-biblical. Because the Bible sees ethnicity from beginning to the end. And when we understand that, we're in a place to say, if I want to zero in on how African American Christians have lived out their faith in America, all I'm doing is looking at one unique manifestation of God's glory. And by doing so, I am in no way stepping outside of God's creational purposes or even what the Bible is talking about. So, this class, does not tell the story of multi-ethnicity in the Bible. You've gotten all that you're going to get on that regard. Right? That was the lecture. Right? That's the one kind of theological framework. But it does look at the ways in which that story has been lived out locally here in the United States. So you're going to get the three elements that I talked about: history, theology, and Bible reading. And like I said, social location does not close us off from critique. So one of the things that I would say separates like a biblical theology of multi-ethnicity and diversity from a kind of secular understanding is the ways in which the secular culture is basically designed to create this like protective bubble, right? So the idea is, I want to be able to do whatever is my truth and to live out my expression of that as I kind of see fit. And the culture protects me as I exercise that. And then in exchange, I protect you while you exercise your freedoms, right? So it's a bunch of like protective bubbles. And there's a real sense in which we're both protected and isolated from one another because we can't critique, right? The whole idea is the suspension of judgment and the kind of unquestioned affirmation. And the thing that makes the Christian gospel potentially hopeful is that it allows for real engagement rooted in love. Like the Christian is able to say to his friend, I love you, but like pull yourself together, right? The problem is, too often, especially in white Christian context, it has only been that critique, right? It's only been, here are the ways that you need to improve, and there's been no love, and the critique has often been ill-informed and rooted in racial animus, right? So just because it's been a misused thing, it doesn't mean that we can never actually enter community. The long-range goal that I hope emerges is that if we agree that we're trying to read the Bible and do theology together, then once we know one another, we're able to fill in each other's blind spots, which I'll get to in a minute. So that's my biblical account of at least why we should care about ethnicity and diversity and how it relates to God's wider purposes. Any questions, pushbacks, clarifications? Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering how the modern notion of a nation state kind of obscures the theology of nationhood or ethnicity that you...
Yeah, I think that the nation state is really interesting because in some sense it is a product of kind of the colonial, at least in parts of Africa, it's part of the colonial enterprise. And it does in some sense like blur it, because it's not, when I think about ethnicity, I think primarily in terms of cultures more than I think of like nation states. So when I think about the United States, I think that even within like the United States, there's the development of distinctive cultures. And so I think that here's the perfect example. The African immigrant experience is different than the African American experience here. And that those are actually two distinct cultures that exist within the United States, both of whom are black, right? And so I do think God is in some sense glorified through the African diaspora and African Americans coming together. So I think that and the same thing is true when we kind of collapse, which we'll get to later. But when we collapse Asian American, it's one thing, that is there's a multitude of peoples within it. So even though the nation state has created boundaries, I don't think those boundaries have closed off the different cultures that have been created. And I'm more thinking about like the cultures that cluster around ethnic groups rooted in common experiences. Is that helpful?
Oh, I was just going to say, to me it seems, I have a background in political science, and so it seems to me that laws and cultures are also kind of intertwined.
Yes.
Like different places have different legal traditions, and
Yes.
so maybe that's where the confusion with states comes in too.
Yeah, I think what he's getting at though is like the Bible doesn't understand the idea of the modern nation state in the same way that we do. And I think that's fair. So one of the things that I think that is important is, and I modeled this really briefly when I talked about dividing wall. There's a lot of passages in the Bible that seem to directly speak to our issue, but it's rare that they actually speak exactly to our issues. There's often like a couple of hermeneutical steps that you have to take. So like the nation state is an example. So like the Jew-Gentile division is not the same as the black-white division or the black-Asian distinction, right? Asian American distinction. They're different, but they're related. So when I teach this, I take the 2 to 3 minutes to explain that to the congregation if I'm going to teach it, because an idea is only as good as its theological foundations. And so you're correct that like, I think when Jesus talks about go forth into all nations, the word there I think is ethne, if I'm correct. Would someone look it up? I think it's ethne, I'm pretty sure it is. And I think that it's closer to something like people groups than it is like nation states. So I think the commission is not to go into like Canada and the United States, but to go to like the Mexicans and the Koreans and the Ugandans, right? And even within Uganda, you go into the tribes there. That's what I think is going on. So we do have to make that kind of distinction. Yes?
I don't know if there's too many questions.
That's okay.
But this is kind of connected to Jesus on the spot question.
Yes.
You can do whatever you want with.
Yes.
I like your remarks to Revelation 7:9. I'm wondering
Yes.
if you have any comments on the end of Revelation 21, where it says that the kings of the earth will bring the glory and honor of their ethnoi
Yes.
into the city.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the.
I think this is a part of culture. I think this is like, I think that the Bible, I think the Revelation looks like everybody bringing the best of who and what they were into the kingdom of God. That's what I think. The book of Revelation, I will come back to the Howby horse, but I will just say it now, so it's recorded for those of you who was on in and out. The fact that Romans 13 became like the center of political theology and not the book of Revelation is astounding to me. It's astounding. Revelation from the beginning to the end is such a political book. The extensive criticism of Babylon, Rome as Babylon, Rome as paradigmatic evil place, right? And the same as the Babylonians were evil, Rome is evil because it's the same types of sin that empires tend to do. And what happens to Babylon? It is like crushed and torn down. While the peoples of the world bring their glories into God's kingdom. And we somehow turned this book. You see, anyways, never mind. I'll leave that alone. So we're going to take a break now. Why don't you guys come back in about, 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have the second half of the morning session. keep forgetting about this whole technology thing. How was that?
There you are.
Am I good? Okay, so in the morning, we tried to develop a kind of theology of ethnicity and a biblical perspective on why any of this matters. What we're going to try to do now is go from kind of the Bible more broadly to look particularly at African American interpretation and the ways in which I think it might be unique and helpful in the larger project of Bible reading in our day. I'm going to start off with a little bit of a narrative backstory. There'll be more of this later, but I grew up in the African American Baptist tradition. So my neighborhood was all black, my high school was all black, my church was all black. We were so like stereotypical black. On the football team, we had one white guy who was the kicker. Like that was like that was where we came from. And I grew up in a context where like the church was a little bit of here comes everybody, in the sense of like everybody went to church. So it's what you did on, like our religious diversity was like missionary Baptist, primitive Baptist, and like Pentecostals. Like, you know, those, like you're Baptist, you're Pentecostal. And maybe you had some AME people also added to that. And so it was, in my context, the Bible was this source of hope that we used to kind of push back on a culture. I grew up in Alabama, on a culture that was often dehumanizing to black and brown people. And so it was like, the idea was that God saw what was happening to us, and God cared about what happened to us, and God was the means by which we would navigate this complicated reality in which we lived in to make it to kind of like, in some sense, like salvation. There was personal salvation. I don't want to misunderstand that. But salvation was in some parts articulated as like college and the middle class. The idea is that if you kind of followed these rules, you would kind of escape poverty, be able to get a job, and then kind of take care of your family, have a better future. Christian, like eschatological salvation was not separated from it, but personal salvation, but like economic transformation, not in the sense of prosperity gospel, but in the sense of hope was a big part of what we did. So, for example, I noticed a big difference between the way that, like in my context, that we celebrated college graduations versus the way that college acceptance versus the way they were celebrated in white churches. It's a big deal. And they would stand up and they would say, so-and-so got a scholarship to this school for this amount of money. And everybody would go, yay, praise God. And so this idea of like the relationship between the Christian faith and kind of the journey through life was like intricately tied in that context. So the other thing is that I kind of existed, and and once again, we're going to come to this later, kind of in between black nihilism and black hope. And one of the things that has helped me to understand at least one of the sources for confusion as it relates to Christianity in America is that, like, I'm going to speak broadly. When I always say this stuff, like, I know all of this stuff is more complicated, right? But if I gave you every caveat, we wouldn't make any progress, and we only have a week together, okay? So when I talk about, like, white Christianity, I'm speaking broadly, okay? Is everybody out of their feelings? Okay. So I noticed that in general, white Christianity moves from, like, left to right, theologically and politically along the same basic trajectory, right? You can kind of put these things together. There's exceptions to the rules, but so when they think about someone, they tend to think, are you a theological liberal or a theological conservative? And often, but not always, those things are also politically in the same similar places, right? And so in the African American context, it is not necessarily from left to right theologically. It's like between like forms of nihilism. Like there is no hope for the future. You kind of do what you have to do to survive there. In through like black Christianity here and moves out into forms of black nationalism. And so when people then like try to put the like political or theological spectrum from like white Christianity on the black Christianity, it doesn't fit well there's a lot of criticism, a lot of like confusion. So for me, it wasn't the question of, am I going to be a like theological conservative or theological liberal? You see what I'm saying? That's not the question I ever asked myself growing up. Never had that question once. Not once. The question was between nihilism and hope. And in that context, hope was rooted actually in two places we'll get to later. I keep saying we may not get to each later. The two places that there's one form of hope rooted in a strong affirmation of black worth related to the Christian tradition. And there was another sense of black identity rooted in forms of black nationalism. In my context growing up when I was there, the main manifestation of that is the Nation of Islam. So when I would go to work to and from school every day, like the Nation of Islam would be at the corner selling like the newspaper. So that was the alternative. And so when I talk about between black nihilism and black hope, this is the context into which I became a Christian. So me being a Christian was rejecting nihilism on one hand and a particular form of black nationalism on the other. And what I want to say is the third thing that I didn't know it at the time, right? Was like a black ecclesial Christian, a black church Christian. I was a church kid. And what I want to talk about as a model of black biblical interpretation is this thing that I was taught, that I intuited, that I didn't even know what I was doing until it was challenged. And I'm going to present this to you as a way of Bible reading that I think is hopeful for not just black people, for people all over. Because I think this is ultimately biblical interpretation from the heart of the black church. What I mean by this is what I'm going to articulate is, and here's, at least there's Anglicans and a Lutheran in the house, right? The Lutherans like the church fathers too, don't they? Okay, I'm glad. I'm just messing with them. You gotta persecute the Lutherans. Right? It's got to be somewhere in the manual. You're different. We must come for you. No. The idea is that part of what it means to be an Anglican is kind of scripture, tradition, and reason. And the idea of part of what it means to be kind of a part of not just Anglicanism, the great tradition of Christianity, is the recovery of the church fathers and the church mothers as these primary early interpreters. Not that we follow them blindly, but they kind of set the trajectory for what becomes Christianity. I want to contend that there actually are black church fathers and mothers of the faith, the first generation of black believers, similar to church fathers and mothers, whose sermons, scriptures, and theological ideas set the trajectory for the black church. Now, obviously, we can make the larger argument that people like Augustine and Athanasius were themselves African. That's a different conversation. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the actual founding church fathers and mothers who created what became the black church. And I think if we're going to talk about black biblical interpretation, their testimony matters. A return to the sources actually matters. And although there is a great diversity of voices, I'm not going to argue that the black theological tradition is one thing. It's not. I'm going to get to it later. There are streams of it. But I do think there is a consistent voice that emerges. Sorry, I'm in the way here. I think there's a consistent voice that emerges. In the same way, right? There's different ways of looking at the fathers and the mothers of the church in the patristic era, right? We can say, unless all the fathers agreed on it, we're not going to listen to it. But if you read enough of the fathers, and the mothers, you get a sense of their sensibility, right? You get a sense of like, this is the general way in which they approach Christian theology. And yes, within that diversity of voices, I think there's something that called patristic theology that emerges. And I think that the same can be said from the African American tradition. And I didn't even know I was an heir to it until I encountered something else. So I always like to make claims. You can look at, here's your first Google job for those of you who like to research this. I'm not going to cite it here, but in the book that I wrote, Reading While Black, I cite some of them. You can look at the confession statements of the 7 historically African American churches. So these are the denominations, 7 historically black churches. You're like, what are those? You'll know about those by the end of maybe this afternoon. They stand squarely in the mainstream of historic Christian belief and practice. The idea that African Americans don't have sound or coherent theology is a racist slander. We actually have a longer history of being faithful to the great tradition than, let's just say, other folks. All right. And they stand out in their advocacy for justice. So if you look at it, like if you're going to say, well, like, what do black Christians believe? You can go to these 7 denominations, AME, CME, AME Zion, the National Baptist, the Church of God in Christ. You can go and look at these and say, well, look at these. Now, you might not agree with the theology, right? You might say, I'm not a Pentecostal if you look at the Church of God in Christ. But like they believe what Pentecostals believe, and in so much as Pentecostals are Christians, they're Christians, right? So you don't say like, I'm not a Pentecostal. Well, like, you know, that's between you and the Lord and the Holy Spirit. Okay. The other thing that you can do is you can look at every major analysis of faith in the United States. Go look at the Pew Research surveys and look at black religious practices. You'll see that they stand out in church attendance, prayer, Bible reading, all of these things. And the place that you actually see separate, it's like the Red Sea divides, is when they start talking about issues of injustice. And the black church tradition, the black Christian tradition continues to have high levels. Like the same amount of us who read the Bible and pray and go to church on Sunday believe that there's a problem with racism as it relates to police. And then in the evangelical tradition in particular, we're together on Bible reading, we actually attend church more, we pray more, but there's a wide divergence on issues of injustice. So this tradition is often out of place amongst other traditions. So like I said, we don't fit very well within white evangelicalism. Let me tell you about this. Do I have this? Okay. I'll make sure I'm going to do this. Okay. And these are the traditions that I'm going to talk about, at least in the time that I have this morning. This is, I'm going to talk about white evangelicalism. I'm going to talk about the white mainline tradition. I'm going to talk about the black progressive tradition. And once again, I may not always be as nuanced as you would like, but I'm hoping to avoid caricature. So push back on me if I'm being caricature. But if you're just in your feelings, like process your feelings somewhere else. And I'm going to articulate a hope for a fourth thing. That's the fourth thing that I'm calling black ecclesial theology. Not that I'm creating, that I think exists. It doesn't get a lot of academic or public articulation. So now a little bit about my experiences again. So I'm using me as a way of talking through these traditions. When I got to my senior year in college, not senior in college, senior in high school, I was recruited to go to the school called the University of the South, also known as Sewanee. It started the long journey of me ending up in the Shelter House, which is not the story I'm going to tell now. But one of the things when I was being recruited, I was told that if you get a degree from here, the sky's the limit. Because you have access to all of these people and these social networks and all of these things that are going to like set you up for life. And I'd never met an Episcopalian. I didn't even know what an Episcopalian was. I thought the Reformation happened and we all became Baptists and Pentecostals. Seriously, that was what I thought. And I remember, I think at the time it was like $32,000 a year, I think it's a tuition. Forgive me if I'm wrong, Sewanee alumni. And I remember like the person said, you can get a $120,000 education. That was more money I ever had seen in my life. I was like, amazing, I'll take that. And so I went to college and I was going to be a religion major because I grew up in the Black Baptist church. I wanted to be a pastor. So I wanted to do religion and history because these were my two favorite subjects, like the Bible and the ways in which, you know, it shaped me and also the history of my people. I wanted to know more about the Civil Rights Movement. I studied about the Harlem Renaissance and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and W.E.B. Du Bois and all these people. But I wanted to learn a deeper understanding of history and also theology. But what I didn't know is that I was entering what I've called the 100 Years War between white evangelicals and white mainline people about the future of the South. I didn't understand this. Like, I didn't know there was a fight going on in white Christianity about like what the South is going to look like. And I was in a progressive context, and this is like the best that I can at least articulate what I think was going on. Is the mainline tradition, at least from the way that I experienced it there, was very good at articulating kind of the evils of Southern white fundamentalism, which is actually pretty messed up. Like, just if you think there's a term where I'm going to like give an apologetic for white Southern fundamentalism, this is the wrong lecture. But they were saying like, you know, this is white fundamentalism. Here's how white fundamentalism undergirds white supremacy. Here are all of the evils done in the name of fundamentalism. Therefore, we must like get rid of the Bible of the fundamentalists and replace it with like their understanding of religion, tradition, and truth. Kind of like basically the white progressive consensus on economics, culture, and society. And so I got the idea that yes, like there's a lot of stuff messed up about what the fundamentalists did. But I had this other thing that was going on at the back of my mind, is that I was a casualty in someone else's fight. Because the church that I grew up in said that the white fundamentalists were like bad exegetes. That's what we were told, right? They were bad readers of the Bible, and that what we needed to do was read the Bible correctly. And so my pastor said, you know, like they say that we're inferior. The Bible says that we're created in God's image, right? And so this is how that problem was settled in my context. And so in the attempt to kind of wrest control of the South, I felt like some white progressives like stole the ground upon the feet of the black church in its disdain for the scriptures. Now, that can be understood like in an anti-intellectual way, which what I'm saying, like, I reject higher criticism and I'm not allowed to, like, I don't believe in asking hard questions. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. It's not that they weren't asking hard questions. They were asking the wrong kinds of hard questions, and they were using the hard questions to do different kinds of work, right? Anyone who goes to college and encounters higher criticism in biblical studies and the academic study of theology, the childhood faith that you had is gone, right? Like that kind of Sunday school stuff is forever changed, right? But it doesn't mean that like all of these things have to kind of be tossed away. They have to be thought about differently. And so I felt like in order to kind of fully buy into that entire way of viewing the world as I experienced it, I had to say something along the following, at least as it occurred to me. They seem to be saying that the white fundamentalists were correct in interpreting the Bible, and my mom was wrong. You see it? And in order to like then find liberation, I had to adopt another white guy's interpretation of the Bible. So it's basically like trade one white guy for another white guy. And I said, well, I'm just going to listen to my mom. And that's not just a rhetorical ploy, it's actually the truth, right? If I had my sense of self that came from this practice of Bible reading in my context, and you tell me, don't trust this white guy, trust me, I'm going to be skeptical of your skepticism. So I said, you know what? That's not my lane. So the next group that was floating around on campus in this 100-year war were my evangelical brothers and sisters, who I were told they were the worst. Watch out for the evangelicals. And when I first encountered evangelicalism, in some sense, it was like, oh, like we can kind of get along a little bit. In the sense that we at least were trying to read the Bible together and try to understand, at least I thought that's what we were doing. We're trying to understand what it means and then live it out. So at first, I started hanging out with evangelicalism, and I was like, oh, this isn't so bad. This is like, we believe the Bible. We can hang out together. And I think, now forgive me, Bebbington's quadrilateral, I always get them wrong. Anyone know what this is? It's like the four primary aspects of evangelicalism. It is cruciform, right? is it cruciform? The need for personal salvation, mission, and what's the fourth one? Scripture? Something like that. Something like that. One of the four. I wish I get the fourth one. And all of those things were like true, in so much as like black Christians like talking about the cross. We believe that you should share your faith. You believe in like the need for a personal commitment to Jesus. Like, oh, we're close. But then I realized there was like two unspoken, two more pillars that were never spoken about in public that existed kind of under the surface. And this is what they were. A kind of gentleman's, and I say gentleman because this is mostly male, to be honest, a gentleman's agreement not to talk about issues of race and injustice, because that was like outside of the bounds. And the second one was like a kind of implicit belief in American goodness. And these two things actually work together, because the idea was, given enough time, the America and American church always adopts for the true, the just, and the good. So we should just be patient and relate to issues of race and injustice. So given this, you see what I mean? So like, we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about it because that, is divisive. And we're just going to trust kind of the evolution. It's funny, everyone becomes pro-evolution in this moment. This idea that we're going to kind of evolve out of racism over time, given enough space. And I'll never forget, like, implicitly, I kind of adopted this idea that, things are getting better, but if we ever needed one another, we will like be there. So like, I'm here for like, I'm hanging out and I'm just like, I'm here for the Bible and all of this other stuff. And I never forget when you go all the way back to like, I don't know, Trayvon Martin, 2013, 2014. I just assumed that like, since we believe the Bible, and the Bible talked about injustice, and injustice is happening, it's like 1, 2, 3. And I started talking about these things, and all of a sudden, I was no longer, like, I was put in a different theological category for talking about injustice. Like, you don't believe in, like, the finished work of Christ anymore. There's all kinds of things that were then added. So I was like, well, hold on. If this is going to be, if the requirements for membership is swallowing up different parts of myself, then this is insufficient. So I recognized that at that point, I had spent a significant portion of my academic career reading only white theologians. I think that let me say this. I think that it is the case that I was never assigned an African American in seminary. I could be wrong, but I think it is the case that I was never assigned an African American in seminary. So I said, I need to find some black scholarship for my soul. So has anyone ever heard of the actress, writer, Issa Rae? She was at the Emmys a couple of years ago, and they said to her, who are you rooting for in the Emmys or the Oscars or one of these? I'm rooting for everybody black. Like, if you're black, I'm on your team. And I had that sense as a scholar that I just wanted to find some black voices. And so this was my first encounter with what is known popularly as liberation theology. And the best way that I can explain this is I had this strange feeling of being both at home and not at home. Where it was like, yes, but no. I can't really go into all of the details. It'll come up in passing as we go on. But I like to think about it as a barbecue. At least in the black community, we often have these barbecues. And every time we had these barbecues, everybody would come to my grandmother's house. My grandfather was a pastor. I have an uncle who was a police officer. I had another, have a cousin who's not a believer. I have a cousins who aren't believers. I have, friends who are like a part of the nation and those kinds of things. Friends who become black Hebrew Israelites. We would all hang out together. And the conversation was like pretty robust between us. Like, I'm speaking from a Christian perspective. Another friend is talking about what it means like to be a black Hebrew Israelite, and that was the conversation. It was robust. I felt like the conversation that I was reading didn't have everybody from the barbecue in print. It was like a certain stream from the black Christian tradition. our liberationist strand, which we're going to talk about later, is there. But I felt, as much as I agree with some of their analysis of kind of what was happening in like not just American culture, but global culture, I didn't always agree with some of the solutions that they proposed. And so I found myself going on a search. Because the thing that was really interesting about me and my early encounter with Black liberation theology is that I was told that this was Black theology. That's like, but I wasn't taught that. Like, I grew up in a Black context. I knew people who believed that, but there was a lot more going on, like, in the Black church context in this particular articulation of it. And so I said, well, I need to go and do a search for the primary sources. This is where Anglicanism might have influenced me, right? It's the Anglican enemy that said, let me go to the roots. So this is kind of an Anglican influence, kind of re-reception. And so I went back and I started reading sermons, confessional statements, slave testimonies, and I am going to articulate to you all, or show you all, what I found, and then I'm going to articulate what I think is the method that I think emerges from my reading of those sources. Any questions so far about my overview of how we ended up here? So this is kind of a whirlwind tour of the exegetical communities that I've known. The mainline tradition, the evangelical tradition, and the Black progressive tradition.
Just like the time frame.
Yes.
So, I mean, this search, when was this in your life that you came to this point?
So this is college through, basically this is over the last, from the age of like 18 until last week. So when did so like, I could say like the mainline tradition was college, evangelicalism was like seminary. Rooting for Everybody Black was like after seminary when I like starting in, like, it's a really complicated timeline because this is what I want to say. I didn't ever lose this Rooting for Everybody Black like idea. Like I was never like, oh, evangelicalism is the only way to be a Christian. I spent 18 years in the Black church and I've always had this ethos. I just didn't understand why I didn't fit. So until like the conscious search probably began in 2013. It was really interesting because it was then when, it's a much more personal story, but here you go. I'm going to the University of St. Andrews, get into St. Andrews, study a PhD, N.T. Wright, the leading New Testament scholar in the world, and the fall before, I think the summer before I go to college, or maybe the summer when seminary, I think this is correct. Forgive me, my wife says I'm horrible at timelines, but the summer before I go is when Trayvon Martin is killed. And I began to think that was the first like shake in my like academic career. So like if you listen to any sermon that I ever preached, it was always there. But like my academic career was like, it kind of shook it. Cause it's like, well, hold on. None of this stuff that I'm writing and researching is relevant to the issues and concerns of the community that shaped me. But at that point, I already had my PhD set and I'm doing a PhD in St. Andrews on Galatians. So I kind of like, it was in the back of my head, but I kind of kept going. But then towards the back end of 2015, 2016, coming into the Trump election, I called it the second red summer. We all know about the first red summer. It was when African Americans came back from World War I. And they were being like, they thought they wanted new freedoms because of the experience they had abroad. And there was this uptick in Black lynchings and Black murder. So I think that coming out of Obama, 15 into 16, when you started seeing all of this like violence against Black people, especially at the hands of the police. And I said, something is happening in America. And I have to be able to produce scholarship that fits with the America that I'm returning to. And I saw this from abroad. So what became the book in this method began as a result of what happens at the beginning of like 15 and 16. So it's really interesting this coming out now, 4 years later, and the things that I intuited then have become even more pressing now. So, any other questions? So, speaking of Anglicans and Episcopalians, this is an Anglican because he was actually in the Church of England at the time. So I think he's in Virginia, and I don't know why I didn't write his name down, but I always like to shame my own tradition. So this is someone who was evangelizing the slaves somewhere in the South, and this is the statement that he made the slaves say before they would agree to be baptized.
Is this Bishop Meade?
No, this is not Meade. It's someone else. I forget his name. It's completely gone. If he said it, I can look it up later. I'm horrible with names, and I should have written it down. You declare in the presence of God and before this congregation that do not ask for holy baptism, and have any design to free yourself from the duty and obedience that you owe to your master, while you live, but merely for the good of your soul, and to partake of the graces and blessings promised to the members of the Church of God in Christ. Shockingly, this method of evangelization was not successful. In the early mission to the South by the Episcopalians, what becomes the Episcopal Church, and even largely the Presbyterian Church that adopted this mode, fails. What we now know is the mainline tradition, and the initial evangelization of African Americans does not go well. So try again. The Great Awakening in the 18th century. Now, this is really interesting because this is really, really interesting. What becomes the African American church has its roots in the Great Awakening, which links African American Christianity genealogically to elements of evangelicalism. This is just a historical fact. Now, the doctrine of grace. Now, this is how this message is received, not how it's articulated. So I don't want you to hear that the evangelicals were better at this than like the mainline people. But the way in which they preached the gospel that all humanity was sinful and equally in need of a savior carried the implicit idea of the worth of black bodies and black souls, right? So if we're all equally sinful, then we're all equally broken, therefore we're all actually equal, especially those who are transformed by Christ. Now, this is not practice, right? This is not like that they actually said this and that the evangelicals said, let's create the just and equal society because of this. It's just that they had a doctrine that allowed for an easy adaptation in what becomes African American context, the slave context at the time. There is also the reality of the polity of Baptist and Methodist. So here is where, like, as an Anglican or an Episcopalian, I'm going to tell you about how our polity messes us up. What do you need to start a Baptist church? You need the Holy Spirit. And you don't even need a Bible, but that's good to have if you can get one. So the polity of the Baptist tradition allowed for Africans or the enslaved to choose their own leadership. And they could say this person is gifted, and then this person could have the spontaneous expansion of the church. So it was not under the authority of white slave masters. Because the Methodist tradition did not have the same apostolic succession hang-ups, you could also do a similar thing in what became the AME, which also allows for black leadership and the rapid expansion of black churches throughout the South, and especially as you move to other parts of the country. Now, if you're Presbyterian and or Episcopalian, you have to have a bishop to ordain you. And the question is, was the white bishop at the time going to choose the most effective minister of the gospel or the person who they were most active that they can control? And so the polity of our traditions limited the spontaneous expansion of that expression within African American communities. So it is not the case. Now, I'm not going to there are black churches that are formed by people who are ordained, but it was just not as rapid as you could do in a Baptist context. So that means, there's actually an implication for this, but I just like to say them in this context. Black people aren't ontologically Baptist, right? We don't just like free church stuff more than they like structure. It's because the structure was rooted in white supremacy at the time, which limited black expansion. And the Baptist tradition didn't have that limitation, so it expands. The way that you understand this, you pick these same polities up and you put them in other parts of the world. You look at what's going on in Uganda. Once you have black indigenous leadership, who choose their own leadership, you get a rapid expansion of the church. The other thing is, to be honest, Episcopalians, and this is actually in the data, this is not me making this up. The Episcopalians and Presbyterians were boring. And all of the emotionalism of the Great Awakening was a much more excitable thing, right? And so it's actually the vibrancy of the Great Awakening was more appealing to the enslaved than some of our boring stuff. So, what did African American Christians do? And this is one of the things I saw that really stuck out a lot once I began to read the primary sources. Is that black Christians loved, oh, you can't see it yet. They loved Acts 17:26, and I think I got the verse wrong. But it's now we recognize it was a mistranslation of King James. But it's the of one blood God has created all mankind. You know that one? It may be 24. I think I might have had a typo in there. But the idea was in the King James version, it says, of one blood he's created all mankind that doth dwell upon the earth. And the idea was that, Acts 17, it's really interesting to see the kinds of texts that people turn to that become central text. I mean, you can find this across the conversion literature in African American text, the testimony of the formerly enslaved and abolitionists. We go to Genesis 1:26 to 28. They went to Acts 17:26, I think it is. Is that the right verse? Has anyone looked at it? It is. Okay. Yeah. So it's like up from one man is what I think it says in our version.
It says from one ancestor.
Yeah. So in the Greek it says from one. I don't know if I didn't look into why they did one blood in the King James. So there's a text variant. But anyways, they said, oh look, the Bible speaks of our common ancestors. We do Imago Dei. They did Psalm 17:26, and they said, look, we're a part of a universal brotherhood. Therefore, you can't enslave us. And there was this radical critique of the hypocrisy of white Christian slave owners. There is another tradition that you see equally prominent. It's what I call internalization, submission. And some of this is understandable because some of this stuff was slave literature where they were actually still enslaved. So you saw some of the brotherhood and the critique by liberationists in the North. So you see someone like Frederick Douglass is kind of the brotherhood, strong critique. But some of the people who are enslaved are like, well, yeah, we need to submit to our masters, work hard, and then one day kind of go to glory. So there's one tradition then that comes to Christianity that does the submission and critique. And then the other tradition that you see, interestingly, is the revolutionary tradition. This is someone like Nat Turner. I shouldn't say this. I think this is the case. The three largest rebellions in the South, slave rebellions, were led by Christian pastors. The interesting thing, can we talk about American hypocrisy for a second? There's this implicit universal condemnation of slave revolts, but at the same time, at least when I was in school, I thought whenever I heard about a slave revolt, I was hearing about something bad. And then the Boston Tea, the tea revolt was good. I never understood this. We have this strong, and actually I'm not a revolutionary in the sense of I'm actually not from the third tradition. I think I'm from the first tradition, which we'll get to later. But I just don't think that we sometimes examine the biases that we have on the one hand, this strong imposition of Romans 13 on black Christianity. But at the same time telling a story about we're upset about taxation or representation at the start of war. You see the way in which texts are used differently and how Romans 13 is never applied to the American Revolution. I'm sorry, I'll leave that alone. Okay. So, the three responses: brotherhood and critique, submission and revolution. I will say that the vast majority, this is hard to quantify, but the vast majority, I would say maybe 65 to 70%, this is me picking a number, comes from the first strand, maybe then 15% and 15% on the other two strands. So the early testimony of black churches. This is the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and its founding. This is the story that they tell. In November 1787, the colored people belonging to the Methodist Society in Philadelphia convened together in order to take into consideration the evils under which they labored, arising from the unkind treatment of their white brethren, who considered them a nuisance in the house of worship, and even pulled them off their knees while in the act of prayer and ordered them back to their seats. For these and various other acts of unchristian conduct, we considered it our duty to devise a plan in order to build a house of our own, to worship God under our own vine and fig tree. People always ask, like, why is there a black church? It shouldn't be a black church. It shouldn't be a white church. It should be the church of God. Well, they explained to you why they started the black church. That they went there to kneel during prayer, and they were told that they couldn't be there, and they were carried out of the church. They were literally carried out of the building. And so from that came what is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And the idea is that they said they couldn't practice their Christianity properly in this context. They called the actions of their white Christian brothers and sisters unchristian. And so if you look at what becomes the AME, and you can go back and you can look this up still online, what they have as the part of their confessional statements is the 39 articles modified in the Methodist direction, similar to like how the Methodists have their own version, kind of like the remix of the 39 articles. And they have basically the same book of Concord, but you see this interesting addition. This is actually, I think, as a part of their baptismal instruction. This is what the AME says. What should be done for the extermination of slavery? We will not receive any person into our society as a member who is a slave holder, and any who are now members that have slaves and refuse to emancipate them after notification, being given by the preacher having the charge, they shall be excluded. So they kept basically the doctrines of the Methodist Church, and they added in a strong abolitionist message. The amazing thing about this is that, like, looking back historically, everybody agrees with the AME, but nobody agreed with them at the time, right? You see what I mean? At the time, they're saying that in order for me to practice my Christian faith, this is the kind of public stance that I need to operate with. The important part that you need to understand about this too is that we often talk about the relationship between just preaching the gospel and politics. And there was tons of like people who were in the white church who were just preaching the gospel. They didn't touch into the enslaved status of black people in America. But the black church didn't have the freedom to just preach the gospel because they were ministering to enslaved people. So the first question that they had to answer when the black church is born is, how does this religion that I practice speak to my experience? So the black church, slavery is an established law, right? So in so much as you have this, you're engaging in a political activity. So there was never this idea that you can separate personal piety from public action in the African American tradition. It just wasn't there. So most black churches, and you can once again look this up, adopted theologically traditional statements with an added emphasis on social action where appropriate. I'm going to read to you, this is one of my favorite quotes. I love this guy. He's enough to make me go back to being a Baptist. William J. Simmons. This is 1887, so we're 22 years down south of the Civil War. God has permitted us to triumph. This is him talking about what's happened in the church since they've been established. And through him, he has planted in us a vigorous spiritual tree. And since freedom, how has this been growing? Untrammeled, we have, out of our ignorance and penury, built thousands of churches, started thousands of schools, educated millions of children, supported thousands of ministers of the gospel, organized society for the care of the sick and the burying of the dead. This spirituality and the love of the offspring are indubitable evidences that slavery, though long protracted, met in our race a vigorous, vital, God-like spirituality, which, like the palm tree, flourishes and climbs upward through opposition. You see this testimony? Now look here. He didn't just say, I want you to understand. So slavery ends, and there's no social structure. They just kind of send the black people off. So it is the church, the first economic and jointly organized community that takes over the responsibility of building the black community from scratch. So you have the construction of schools and churches and the burying of the dead. And you see this? So there was no separation. This is all a part of gospel ministry in the African American context. You can go back and read about William J. Simmons' theology. He thought that he found these things in the scriptures themselves, this testimony. We're going to fast forward. We're going to have to skip for the sake of time. Basically, post-Reconstruction up through before the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. There's an interesting period of what African Americans are doing between like 1890 and like 1950. We're just going to have to leave it to the side. Long story short is there's the claim that because of the excesses of Jim Crow, there was not as much space for African American expression, and a lot of African American energy and activism is focused on the development of church structures. So you look at like national conventions and looking at how, like, if you can imagine, like General Convention, right? You can kind of think of that kind of, so a lot of the energy was focused on kind of building black segregated institutions, which is interesting, but it's not as easy to trace as we could do it here. So we're going to skip forward to James Cone, Black Theology, and Womanism. We're skipping forward like, 60 years, 70 years. So the early generation of black biblical interpreters, people like Charles Cofer and Kane Hope Felder, they did a lot of the stuff on black presence in the Bible. Now, this is really interesting because what they want to do is the following. You guys have seen like, what's the name of that movie? The Ten Commandments. Like everybody's white in the Old Testament. And they say, well, hold on. There's a couple of things. And they get in trouble for this, but I actually think they're right. So in the South, they had this thing called the one blood rule. Not one blood, one drop rule. If you had one drop of black blood in you, you were black. You couldn't say like, my great grandmother was black, but I'm not black. You were subject to segregation. And so some of them asked, well, by the standards of how we define blackness today, who in the Bible would be called black? So the question is, could you put this black character up, this is serious, and like drive this person through the South and say, well, actually, I'm actually North African, therefore can I drink the water? The answer is no, like they would have been put in the category. So there was a hypocrisy in the scholarship. So in the scholarship, you had to be like Nubian black to count as black, but in American culture, they put everybody into the category of people to be discriminated against. And so when they start talking about like, were these characters in the Bible black? They're asking, in the context of 1960 to 1970, would these people be subject to discrimination in the South? And in that category, you get lots of black people in the Bible. Now, in some cases, those people are actually also African in like a real, well, they're all African. Some of them were like, the argument was some of them like more dark brown skin. And like some of this like Kush being located in like sub-Saharan versus putting it in the Middle East. So that was part of the scholarship. But a lot of it was understanding the implicit biases that the definition of what it meant to be black changed depending on whether you're talking about laws in the United States versus characters in the Bible. Which is actually what we do today too. All right? We still have like, we somehow separated Egypt from Africa and we've lightened all the Egyptians. Still, right? And so what they did, the early generation, was to say, you can't tell the story of the Bible without including Africa in that story. And so a lot of the early scholarship in black biblical studies was to show that we're parts of that story. What I did with Ephraim and Manasseh was like a small example of that, right? To kind of point out these things were hiding in plain sight. Now, the father of black biblical interpretation, not black, there's black theology that then influences black biblical interpretation, is someone named James Cone. And it would be impossible to talk about all the things that James Cone said in a lecture of this length. What I want to say is that James Cone picks up on the liberative strand of African American Christianity that has been there from the beginning. Emphasis on the God of the Exodus, emphasis on God's identification with the poor. Like you can find this stuff in the black Christian tradition, like all over the place. You can look to like Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave was the 4th of July. He talked about the hypocrisy of American Christianity while also celebrating freedom, but also enslaving black people. So some of the things that James Cone says is just the black Christian critique of like white Christian hypocrisy. Well, there are places where I think that he takes a different road than like what I would want to consider the mainstream African American interpretation. Well, at least he represents a different strand than the one that I like. I mean, I wanted to be honest. The one that I like is the wrong word because it's not about emotion. It's about trying to understand what I think the text is trying to communicate and how to get at what the text is trying to communicate. So it's not actually about, personal preference. That's all concept of it, which the Bible said. Which the Bible said that I could be rich. Okay. Okay. And just step on the poor. I guess I wouldn't want the Bible to tell me to step on the poor. That would be complicated. Anyways, this is a quote where I think I get at where me and him might disagree. He says the hermeneutical principle for an exegesis of the scriptures of the revelation of God in Christ as the liberator of the oppressed from social oppression and to political struggle, wherein the poor recognizes that fight against poverty and injustice is not only consistent with the gospel, but is the gospel of Christ. It's the second part, right? But is the gospel of Christ is where we're going to disagree. I can say, yeah, sure, like God cares about the poor and God wants the poor to be liberated. But I'm not sure you can articulate that as the gospel of Christ. So I think it is the extent of this claim where we divide. Any question about that? I could say some more about that, but I want to stop here. I think what I want to say is that in the Bible, the book of Exodus gives way to the book of Leviticus. The liberation has this telos worship. And that within the biblical narrative, the newly liberated people form a cult whose holiness of life reflects the God who liberates them. So there's a transformative aspect of what the gospel does to people that I see is at least missing. I'm not talking about this entire corpus, but it's missing in this quote. And I want to say that although there are corporate elements to the Christian message in Jesus' kingdom, there's something inextricably personal where the problem isn't simply that I'm not participating in the liberation of other people. The problem is also that there's a sense in which we're all kind of involved in the exploitation of others, and we need to transform our exploitation into advocacy. There's also a sense in which I personally have sinned against the living God from whom I need forgiveness. And I think that part of the Christian message, at least as is articulated here, is missing. Any questions about Cone? I know this is we're going to come back to him, but this is just he gets a whole video.
Question from Danny.
Yes.
Online. Question about whether or not, or how far Cone was reliant on Gutierrez.
So this is do I quote this? Okay, here's the thing. If you can say that the African American church starts out of the Great Awakening, then it's fair to say that what happens with black theology, it is influenced both by liberation theology globally and the progressive turn in mainline institutions. Right? So these two things are happening at the same time. The mainline tradition is going through a theological shift, and that James Cone is not located, is like sitting at Union. James Cone is actually not in the first place yelling at white evangelicals. He's yelling at white mainline people for not being, the white moderate who King is also frustrated with. So I would say there's a sense in which he is both influenced by internationalist liberationist movements, I think, and I think he's influenced by the theological context into which liberation theology is born, which is the mainline institutions, which are going through their own shift. So I think that I think that sometimes people can say, well, the black church, because of its roots in evangelicalism, because of its roots in the Great Awakening, is an indigenous form. But I don't think that you can think that what becomes black liberation theology is created ex nihilo, that both of them are operating out of both contexts. And that's another larger way of saying that Christianity, no form of Christianity springs into existence. We're all a part of a conversation around the nature of the Christian witness. And he was pushing back on a theology They literally had nothing to say that was, like, America was burning in the 50s and the 60s. I can say this too, and I say this, maybe I'll get in trouble for it. There's no more understandable development in the history of Christian theology than black progressivism. Like, what would you do when the people who are sicking dogs on black people are themselves Bible-believing Christians? And the idea is, if your Bible told you to do that, then I reject it. This is what I call atheism of protest. All right? If this is your God, I want nothing to do with it. And so it's easy to sit back now and say, well, you shouldn't say A, B, and C, and understand, like, there was no, the reason that James Cone was I'm thinking not rhetorically. The reason he was at a place like Union was because, like, Nashotah wasn't going to hire him in 1970. Sorry, I love y'all, Nashotah. Like, nobody was, right? Who was going to hire? What traditionally, theologically conservative institution in America was going to hire an African-American theologian? I can say Wheaton wouldn't hire him in 1970. Is that fair? It's my institution. Right? You see it? So this is the place where we have space to do theology, and we're experiencing the rejection of black concern. Like, what kind of theology develops? And the exact same thing, the amazing thing is, the exact same thing is happening right now. We're in the midst of a movement for justice. There are Christians who are saying the Bible speaks to this issue, and then people are saying, if you say this, then you're no longer a good Christian. So the idea is, I either have to say this thing that is happening to me is not happening, or it's not that bad, or I have to find another Christian tradition, or find another tradition altogether. And people have opted for what I want to call an atheism of protest. And if that's the case, then the judgment of God will be upon us who didn't take this seriously. The reason that I write the stuff that I write and do the things that I do is because I don't want my kids to feel like they don't have an option. Yes, sorry.
What you're saying is reminding me of the quote that sort of drew me into the Black church and the African American experience, right on page 4, saying the Black Christians who formed the historic Black churches also knew implicitly that their understanding of Christianity, which was premised on the rock of anti-racial discrimination, was more authentic than the Christianity practiced in white churches.
Yes. Hold on. Let me make this. That is the explicit claim that I make, that we exegeted the Bible better. And we did it because of our social location. Because we existed in a context where we're asking this particular question: what does the Bible have to say about what is happening to me? And on the other side, you have this question: this is what I think happened. I can't psychoanalyze. I'm just speaking from what I see. We have these rights and these privileges as the majority culture. How does the Bible justify that? And I think that starting place of assuming the right to have these things distorted the reading of the Bible. And at point after point after point after point, we all look back and we say, well, the Black church is completely right here. Why couldn't anybody see it at the time? It's because our social location of the white Christians at the time blinded them to what the text said. So social location doesn't give you like magical powers. It informs the kinds of questions that you ask. And sometimes being in the right place, asking the right questions is what unlocks the truth. So we can't really go into this other than to like wave our finger at it. But the next thing, yes, go ahead.
How was Cone received in the Black church among rank and file? Like the
we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. He is received. So James Cone, I think there's a slide where I talk about this, but I'll say it now, and then if the slide comes, this might be redundant. They did a study, and it's in this book. You have to dig, because this book is dated, but I think it still holds. They asked people, how often did you talk about certain things, like Black empowerment, injustice, racism, and like the numbers on that were much higher than when you asked African American Christians if they like cited James Cone or did liberation theology. So there's like the academic manifestation of liberation theology was more prominent in major cities, like places like Chicago and places where there's like New York and places like that, and certain urban areas. And there's kind of like, and I didn't realize this at the time, and maybe I'm going to step on a slide since you asked the question. There's kind of a Southern kind of intuitive liberationist stream that just kind of saw these things and then started talking about them. So one of the big mistakes that I would say that some white Christians make is they don't understand the distinction between the streams of liberation theology. And so some of the things that James Cone said were just true. Right? He has this quote where he says, the fact that God revealed himself as the God of the Israelites and not the God of the Pharaoh makes all the difference. Because he had revealed himself as the God of Pharaoh, and an entirely different Bible would have resulted. And I was like, that's a profound, that's true, right? There's something about God's character that's revealed in the fact that he chose Israel, the stepped on peoples. Now, that's just like something that's just in the Bible. So when you ask like, how is James Cone received? I think that's when I talk about like whole hog theology, where we think that either you're all right or you're all wrong. There's some things that James Cone said, like me and him are in profound disagreement. And I articulated the one there. So I think that and I think it's similar to many theologians. Like you just kind of say, well, wow, you kind of missed the boat here. I mean, we talk about, let me give you an example. How do we make sense of Luther's profound anti-Semitism? Like profound, unrelenting. And we go, you know what? This part of Luther's stuff here is deeply troubling. But we say here, Luther is like, he got this part right. And so I think that what you have to be able to do as an academic, right? As a pastor, I can't speak to what you all have to do. Like, as an academic, I have to say, well, what do I think that Cone did well? And we're going to come back to him, so this is not the end of it. But what I think that, well, it's interesting because the book that you all have, Liberation and Reconciliation, is in some sense a response to James Cone. So I'm going to hold that off until we get there. Because I just wanted you to see the other side of it. Because yes, there's a reason why I gave you Liberation and Reconciliation, right? So, intersectionality. So if you talk about James Cone and the growth of black theology, you have what is called womanist theology, which I should say more about, but we only have so much time. If black theology pointed out the issues of race, and in some places dealt with issues of class, womanism looks at, in part, the intersection of race, class, and gender as the world in which black women experience the world. They don't just experience sexism, they also experience racism. And that's just not just that seems like that's more like the negative aspect of what they say, but it was also a sense of a strong affirmation of the worth of black women as interpreters, who have unique concerns that they have to address and need to be written from the perspective for their communities. And in so much as there are unique experiences that black women face, then that I may not see as an African-American male, then womanism is an important contribution to the intellectual project. We could say more, but we'll just pass it along there. I'm just pointing these things out to you to go and do research on your own. So I found myself asking, okay, what do I do with all of this information? And I'm still reading and I'm reading. And I feel like if Luther had a epiphany where he kind of understands justification, this is the passage that helped me understand what I think. And I call Frederick Douglass the patron saint of black biblical interpretation. So this is Frederick Douglass near the end of his book, end of one of his numerous autobiographies. But he says this: I have in several places spoken in such a tone and manner respecting religion as may possibly lead those unacquainted with my religious views to suppose me an opponent of all religion. What I've said respecting and against religion, listen to this, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land with no possible reference to Christianity proper. But between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be the end of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. It's like, wow, tell me how you really feel, Fred. Okay, one of the things that I liked about this that helped me was Fred's distinction. I think it's a historic distinction, which is, I think that's the one that you mentioned. The difference between like Christianity as it was practiced in America and the actual Christianity of Christ. And that what you see I call this as black audacity, like speaking about Christianity in America in ways to make your ears tingle. And there's strong public critique of hypocritical Christianity while affirming historic Christianity. And I think that this is what marks the African-American interpretive tradition. So one of the things that you see, and this goes all the way back to Frederick Douglass and back behind him, is this strong, public, consistent, unapologetic criticism of Christianity. And I think that the inability to, and he says like, you might think that I don't like Christianity at all. And this is the exact criticism that happens to African Americans today, right? When we give like strong condemnations of Christianity in America, we get accused of not being Christians. I think it's James Baldwin. He said, it's precisely because I love America that I keep the right to criticize her like unrelentingly. So what I started to think about, at least this is what I think happened, as I looked at African American biblical interpretation. And we could talk about this more if you want. This is what I saw from reading the sources. It is unapologetically canonical and theological. This is what I mean. In the context in which slave masters were saying, hey, there's 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 1 to 3. I call it the Lord of Rings theology, the one verse to rule them all. Christians say, well, hold on. You have the entire book of the Exodus. You have all of these places in which God shows himself on behalf of the poor and the marginalized. You see all of these times in which Christ has set us free. There's this, my favorite one is when these slaves write to, I think it's the Massachusetts legislature. And they say, listen, like you tell us that, they're asking for petitioning for freedom. They said, listen, we can't bear our brother's burdens to so fulfill the law of Christ if we're forced to bear our brother's burdens. We can't tell children to submit to their parents if a slave master can come and take the kid and sell it away. So they're saying that the practice of the Christian life pushes on the institution of slavery. So that's what I'm going to talk about, the canonical instinct. The idea to look at the Bible as a whole and say, what kind of God emerges from reading the Bible? This is what I mean when I also said it's theological. Like there were tons of arguments from God's character. God is not the kind of God who would want you to do these things to us. So even apart from the exegetical argument, it was a theological argument that emerged from the canon. So African American theological biblical interpretation is, I want to say, has an inherent canonical instinct, and it is theological. Can I say something about this too? What you think about the canonical instinct? This is going to be New Testament nerd stuff. So if you're not a New Testament person, you're not going to get this. But for some of you, you're going to be like, you're completely right. So around 80 something, Richard Hayes, but behind him, you can go back to, what's the guy's name? Oh, his name. I'll just say Richard Hayes, but the guy who not even E.P. Sanders, but it's this guy who talked about Jesus as a rabbi, and he was the first person who started looking at rabbinic exegesis. But anyways, Richard Hayes in particular started making mainstream this idea of intertextuality. The idea of the reuse of the New Testament and the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? You guys seen that? You've heard of this? And one of the things that they saw once they started doing scriptural reuse is they saw that the Exodus is everywhere. That all of the time they're referring to the Exodus, and all of these allusions and these hints are the entirety of the New Testament is rooted in this Exodus as being paradigmatic. We're like, you're amazing. Here's tons of PhDs on intertextuality and the importance of the Exodus for understanding Christianity. Do you know who said that? 200 years before that, or 100 years before that? Black people. We were doing intertextuality 100 years ago. Saying the God of the Exodus, right? So you can go and look at how many white people got PhDs in the early 2000s talking about the echoes of Exodus across these different letters. It's like we told you 100 years ago. Anyways, canonical and theological interpretation, right? Theological biblical interpretation, which is what we do here at the show and everywhere else. Who was doing it? We were. From a myopic one-verse theology to a canonical and theological instinct is something that I saw from looking at these texts. It was socially located in that it was unapologetically arising out of the particular context of Black Americans. Because we were in slavery and because we're under the oppression of Jim Crow, we're asking, what does Christianity mean in this context? I wrote an article once in the New York Times called The Bloody Fourth Day of Christmas, in which I talked about the massacre of the Holy Innocents. And I asked, well, why do we tell that story? And I said, there is no other world in which the incarnation occurs than the world in which tyrants slaughter innocent children. This is the place in which the incarnation occurs. It's the social context. You have to make sense of Jesus being born into a world that slaughters babies. So when I talk about the social location of African Americans, I mean that we are asking, what does it mean to be a Christian in America as Black? One of the things that I'm going to sound like I'm complaining now, but and I'll have to just, hopefully, we're not going to get everywhere we're going to get, but we'll do one more slide after this. It's into 12:30. I'm going to get there. Don't worry about it. One of the things that I see so often is that I hear sermons that almost like preach to no one in particular. You know what I'm talking about? They're like generally true, but not particularly true. Like, when I talk about socially located, these were exegesis, where they realized the people who came into the congregation were experiencing particular things. I would say this is the other one. This is willing to listen to the ways in which scriptures themselves respond to and redirect Black issues and concerns. What I mean by this is that the scriptures weren't simply the arena upon which we went and said, here are the ways which the scripture informs the things we already want to do. But we were redirected by the scripture. So one of the things that I talked about is the idea of universal brotherhood that we talked about earlier. That idea of universal brotherhood was just not native to Black people. It's because we saw in Acts 17:26 the idea that God wanted to create one family. And so this is the ways in which the scriptures themselves shape the Black hope for the future. Patience with the text. What I mean here is, and this is actually, I think, something that's really important as a gift to the wider church. One of the things that I've seen happen is that when some white Christians kind of finally figure out what's happened in America, they get this real sense of, how can I be a Christian knowing all of the stuff that we've done? And so they have to kind of process it. And African Americans, like, we have the advantage of never having believed the propaganda. Like, from the moment that we became a Christian, we had to deal with the fact that these texts had been used against us. So we had to do the theological work early of being patient. And this is what the patience is what kind of gives rise to the canonical instinct. And I want to say that that's a part of what marks our tradition. The other one is, and this is the final one, willing to listen to Black and white critiques of the Bible in the hopes of achieving a better reading. What I want to say this is that, like, most of my white Christian friends have never seriously intellectually wrestled with Black nationalism, like the Nation of Islam or Black Hebrew Israelites. It's so far from like their context. They can understand every argument to like defeat German liberalism, but they can't actually talk to the Black person down the road. So part of what it means to be an African American Christian, especially who's trained in like higher education, is that we understand both the white intellectual history while being socially located in a place where there's an entire criticism of Christianity that have been like largely unheard. The interesting thing about this is that like, the internet is changing that, right? Part of the reason some of y'all in this class is like that conversation that's going on in the Black community is starting to like trickle over into mainstream discourse. So what I'm saying is that if you're an African American Christian, you've listened to black secularist critiques of Christianity and white secularist critiques. So we tend to have like a pretty broad understanding of different theological movements if we're not completely cut off. What I want to say is that I think these cluster of things are not exhaustive, but it's what I found when I tried to figure out what was the black church doing that allowed it to function as Christians in America. And these were kind of the principles that I saw. And I don't think that they're like the only ways of reading the Bible. I think that my vision is you need African American interpretation and Ugandan interpretation and Cuban interpretation, where each culture has its own blind spots. And that together, reading the Bible, bringing the question that we have to the text, and letting the text answer us back is the means by which we might together discern the mind of Christ. So this is completely unscientific, okay? Okay? Completely unscientific, this next slide. Of all the things, it's the most made up thing that I have. So what I wanted to show you then is that the black theological exegetical spectrum, what I've tried to outline, the different ways of reading the Bible, does not run along the same lines as white churches. So this is the numbers that like Esau meandering the world. So this is not like data anyway. I probably could figure out how to do this, but I'm lazy. Okay. If I had to break this down into like categories of what you will see like out in the world, I would say about 60% of black Christianity, or black Christians in America, are a part of kind of the traditional black church tradition. These are the ones you're going to hear about this afternoon. Well, there's a strong social critique. Frederick Douglass, think Frederick Douglass. Traditional theology, think the AME, but with a strong emphasis on social action. I would say this is like over half of the black Christian tradition comes from this place. The progressive black church tradition, I would say is around 20%, 15 to 20%, which is the same social critique and the revision of some theological ideas with the same emphasis on social action. One of the things is like these two traditions will often look very similar. And one of the things that actually is true of the black church is not true of kind of what I understand about like white churches, is that these two groups are often still in community with one another. So like someone from the progressive black tradition would invite a traditional black church pastor to preach. So there's a little bit more cooperation, and there's not the strong like binaries that you will see. Because they would tend to be together on social critique, they'd be together on social action. There's some of the theological ideas are going to be different. The third category, which I created after I wrote the book, so this isn't in the book, this is what I've kind of updated this, is black pietism, which focuses on holiness and salvation. And it is a muted personal like critique. So like you're not going to see like black pietists like advocating publicly for justice like you might see in like traditional black church, but it's mostly for pragmatic reasons. You know, they either say, you know, I'm just going to focus on like what I can control in my church, and I'm not going to like do a whole lot, mostly because of a variety. So, but it's not necessarily that. I think these two are oftentimes mixed together. So the black pietist, so you think of like the super sanctified, super Christian person black woman or black man who understands racism is real, but activism isn't really necessarily their thing. This is the fourth one. Black accommodationalism. I don't know if accommodationalism is a word, but I made it up. This is it adopts the personalist focus of white evangelicals. So they kind of said, yes, like this idea of personal salvation is super important. And there's often a critique of black church social action. And it's kind of like a disdain for this tradition. And I will say that in general, these are the people who are promoted in conservative white Christian spaces. the black Christian who kind of repeats all the talking points, who says all the things that like you would hope that black people would say, but like a white person wants the black person to say, but they don't say it. I would say, and this is what I want you to understand. I think that these people come to these opinions honestly, but they're a significant minority in the African American tradition. I think that the pietist number the third category, like goes up and down depending on the moment. So like a pietist could like bump up to traditional black church action, depending on the situation, like at a heightened moment of culture. This number here has remained low. Interestingly enough, for a lot of reasons, black accommodationalism remains very popular because it's a good boogeyman. It's not just a good boogeyman for kind of white evangelicalism. It's also sometimes even a good boogeyman for like progressive black Christians who say, well, that's really not, it's a complicated thing. Sometimes like we think that the two options are black accommodationalism and black radicalism. And there's a lot more going on in the black Christian tradition than that. So what I tried to, I think, do was articulate kind of a lot of what I think is going on in the top category. That's at least what I wanted to talk about. I don't have time. I have an entire another lecture about an actual what this looks like in practice. But I only have 10 minutes, so I have to stop and take some questions here.
Are you willing, I push this a little bit, but are you willing to put any names up here?
No.
No.
No, I'm not.
Well, I mean, Jeremiah, right, we know where to put him.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not going to name any black accommodationalists because they would not think of themselves in that way.
They're part of the gospel coalition.
I'm not going to say that. What I'm saying is, actually, I would say that not everybody in the gospel coalition even falls in that. Because I have friends who are there. So what I'm saying is, like, one of the things that I don't do, and this is actually important because this is what I mean. It is easy to get mad at black Christians who are then used by white Christians. So you can say something like the Gospel Coalition are like highlighting these black voices. And so the idea is to attack. I don't think, like, I have a friend who's in the gospel. I have two people who I know who write for the Gospel Coalition who I think are like good, faithful people. And so I just try not to put names on things where they wouldn't describe themselves this way. What I want to say is this though. The problem is not that black people disagree from the consensus. The world doesn't work like that, right? You're never going to get 100% of people to agree that this is the problem, this is the solution. So a black Christian can read the Bible and come to these conclusions about this is how you should function. And I could profoundly disagree with them. The problem isn't that they exist, because I talk to these kinds of people, right? I have black friends, well, not black friends, I have black people who I know who are like, who kind of inhabit this world. The problem isn't that they exist, the problem is that they're amplified. So the problem is there's people who have a vested interest in seeing that this is the voice. Finally, this is the black guy who gets it. So the solution to that isn't to like condemn in the first place the black person. The question is, why is this voice being highlighted? Because there's a vested interest in highlighting these voices because it allows not to change the status quo. And the requirement cannot be, we have to get 100 black Christians to say something for white Christians to listen to it. If 95 or 97, whatever the number is, if you get that many people to agree, and the reason I'm not gonna list names because it's a manifestation of the same thing because we're attacking the person for disagreeing. What I'm saying is, if you have an entire like huge sections of the tradition, right? If you're saying the traditional black church, if you're saying the black progressive tradition and the black holiness tradition, the holiness tradition is not taken seriously. The holiness tradition, and I'm saying that like I'm not saying holiness being more broad and not just a denomination. That tradition, even though the critique is sometimes muted, it's still there. So if all of these people are saying this, and all these people are being ignored, and these voices are lifted up, the question is, why are these voices being lifted up, and who benefits from having them lifted up in that way? Because if it was simply just a marketplace of ideas, and they have their ideas, then that would be fine. But it's a disproportionate influence. And I've tried to say that, like, it's not my job to, like, articulate, because the point is, you're never going to get that number down to 0, right? And even if you did, let's say, for example, you got every single black person in America, all of us, to agree. Would you then think that the people who are determined not to listen to us are going to say, yes, we're sorry? They're not. They'll just say we're all, like, wrong. So what those voices do is they allow for the inability to, like, actually assess the problem. You know? Because I'm just trying to tell you, like, those voices have existed within the African American Christian tradition from the beginning. So when I talk about the black pietist tradition and the black accommodations tradition, goes all the way back to what I talked about. You see some of this coming out of slavery because they're saying, let's just focus on the by and by. So it's not a new tradition, it's just like, it has always been amplified. So I try to reserve my critique for the amplification, not for the ideas themselves. Because, like, I just don't believe that you're ever going to get everybody to agree on anything. So I just try to disagree as charitably as I can. Any other questions?
I think we got a few more introductions from those students.
Okay, students who I didn't get to introduce themselves. Wait, are there new students who came in or who are online? Okay.
Back here and then some more online.
Okay, so we'll do, well, actually, you know, I'm going to let them leave. We'll introduce them at the beginning. It's 7 minutes early. I always like to let students leave early. We'll introduce you all at the beginning of the next session because we're already behind. So when we come back next time, we will do, like, a case study in putting some of this into practice. I'll give you, like, a little bit of a interpretive lecture where I kind of put some of this into practice and go through a topic. And then we will switch over into the historic 7 black churches. All right, I'll see you all this afternoon.